Good morning. Welcome to these presentations of the evolving moment, reversibility in time in relation to the other. And I'm just going to read our abstract just to ground us in the subject matter. Time has a dynamic structure where forward movement reshapes the past, which in turn pulls us into transformations of the future. This reversibility of time helps answer the question of how human beings might seize their fleeting moments while the iron is hot and realize the unique significance of their lives while they are living it. The key is that the reversibility of time is inextricably situated within a complex interchange with the other. And we're going to begin today hearing from Dr. Jack Foehl. Dr. Foehl is a training and supervising analyst at Boston Psychoanalytic Society and Institute, supervisor and faculty member at the Massachusetts Institute for Psychoanalysis and at the Harvard Medical School. He is clinical associate professor adjunct at the NYU postdoc program in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, assistant editor for Psychoanalytic Dialogues, and is an editorial board member of the International Journal of Psychoanalysis and board member of the Boston Group for Psychoanalytic Studies. Jack writes in the areas of phenomenology and psychoanalysis, addressing the nature of clinical experience and psychoanalytic process, describing subjectivity, intersubjectivity, and properties of the phenomenal field. He has developed a way of considering depth as a perceptual phenomena applicable to the psychoanalytic setting. Jack is in private practice in Brookline, Massachusetts. It's my pleasure to hand it to you, Jack.
Oh, thank you. Hi. Just to differentiate, what I've developed as a concept is depth, not death. Although maybe death would be more appropriate given our topic today. So, I think this will be fun. You know, this is such an amazing conference because it brings together people of a lot of different disciplines, and it's such an indulgence for us as clinicians to be able to talk philosophically. But we also like to talk clinically as well, and to think about our clinical work and the specificity of clinical work as it is informed by philosophy. So I think both Peter and I will be doing something in that regard. We're going to talk about clinical material. Now, because we are, I'm going to remind you all that we take very, very seriously the issue of confidentiality. Although we're going to be each talking about one of our patients, and even though we've heavily disguised the work with them, it's still very important to sort of be really attentive and respectful. It's such an amazing thing that people allow us into the depths of their life. And that we can learn from them. So I just want to make sure we all remember to respect that, okay? All right. So my talk specifically, I call it Avant Coup, Reversibility and the Other. Après coup is synonymous with Nachtraglichkeit. But there are a number of European analysts who talk about its relationship to avant coup. You know, we have before and the after. So let's see where we go. As a part of a continuing project to highlight the importance of the phenomenological study of experience in psychoanalytic process, I'm going to say a few things about temporal experience as it plays out in the moments of the clinical situation. I'm going to describe a fragment of a session with Yusef, a young man in psychoanalysis for several years. But in offering this description, I'm hoping that you will join me by listening with different ears, seeing with different eyes, sensing, indeed perceiving time as it unfolds, folds back on itself, and unfolds again. In my clinical work, I'm informed as I am by contemporary psychoanalytic thinking. I'm compelled by the intersection of a phenomenological stance, of a psychoanalytic stance, and a phenomenological way of seeing. Over the past 30 years or so, there has been a profound transformation in how many psychoanalysts make sense of clinical process. There has been a profound shift from an emphasis on conception to an emphasis on perception. Perception doesn't simply refer to seeing, but to the full spectrum of sensing, the rich embodied synthesis of experiencing at the center of being. There are a lot of influences for this shift, and I really can't go into them here other than to indicate that the discovery of the intersubjective foundations of our work and the foundations of subjectivity has led us to work differently, to see how some of our fundamental thinkers in psychoanalysis were describing a new emphasis well before we could grasp it ourselves. Winnicott, for example, writes about creative apperception. He means by this term that the aim of treatment and of his work is one of being fully and creatively alive. His focus is not on what we know, but on how we live, specifically how, and this is to quote Michael Parsons, how an experience in the present takes on layers of meaning because we relate it to a whole variety of past experiences. But the past shifts and takes on new meanings as we find it emerge in the present. So perception is central to a phenomenological stance. A young Jean-Paul Sartre describes how we typically forsake perception in favor of what he called at the time digestion. He says, to know is to eat. We have all believed that the spidery mind trapped things in its web, covered them with a white spit, and slowly swallowed them, reducing them to its own substance. What is a table? A rock? A house? It's a certain assemblage of contents of consciousness, a class of such contents. Oh, digestive philosophy. Yet nothing seemed more obvious. Is not the table the actual content of my perception? Nutrition, assimilation. The simplest and plainest among us vainly looked for something solid, something not just mental, but would encounter everywhere only a soft and very genteel mist, themselves. You gotta love Sartre. Put very simply, the world and our place in it come to be encountered and known through representations in the mind. In Sartre's graphic imagery, we typically think that we digest what we perceive into our own psychic secretions. We assimilate what is other into ourselves, quote, a very soft and genteel self-sameness. The cul-de-sac of this digestive model is that it leaves us locked into what Sartre calls a dark stomach of knowing, ever separate from the world that we hope to grasp. You gotta love that. The guy. But phenomenologically, when we suspend this digestive assumption, and that's phenomenologists starting with Husserl call that suspension the epoche. We find perception out there. Sartre says, in contrast to this digestive model, to know is to burst toward already in the world. Without an assumed separateness from the world, we are suddenly part of it. Sartre says, consciousness and the world are given at one stroke. And from this phenomenological attitude, we aren't holding things in mind. We are ever unfolding, co-creating self and world and other. An image is never static. It's imaging. The body is an object. It's an interwoven and intercorporeal field. The other is separate only in an intersubjective context, and time in its pasts and futures are experienced in the moment now, a waking, dreaming process. Rather than an isolated series of nows, there is a temporal horizon where every now implicates a past and future in it. In a dynamic relationship. And rather than simply moving forward and unfolding of experience in time, the movement of time reverses. It folds upon itself as memory is transformed by the present, and that's apreku, Nachtraglichkeit, where our memory is constantly evolving and changing in its significance given the experience of what's going on now. And we anticipate the future in light of a present transformed by the now deepened experience of the past. And that's avant-coup. The future is always changing in relationship to a present that has a transformed past that changes the experience of the present and leads us to an unfolding future that is always changing. So there's this dynamic process of change in relationship, folding and unfolding, moment by moment by moment. Okay, so I'm now going to present a clinical moment. I'm going to contextualize the moment, but really, like, literally 5 minutes of a clinical session, okay? But I'll contextualize it a bit to sort of elucidate and give us something to think about in discussion. So when she called seeking treatment for her son, Yosef's mother told me that he was an unusual, precious soul. She worried about how stuck he was in college, having a sense that he did little work, but she said that I would be captivated, perhaps entranced by him. Indeed, this young man was striking when I met him, a young Omar Sharif, gracious, inquisitive, and warm. He really didn't know why his mother insisted on treatment, other than his difficulty with completing assignments. He glowed with a warmth and appreciative receptivity that left me very eager to see him again. Yosef's Jordanian parents are both doctors, and they feel their son would be well suited for medicine, but he wasn't so sure. His mother doted and cajoled and threatened, with Yosef retreating silently to his room. Yosef was intrigued by our interactions and agreed to return to think about being stuck and about a future that remained undefined for him. As we progressed, it gradually came clear that Yosef had little sense of his inner life. He didn't have a language for his states and feelings, in spite of being quite sensitive towards others. He couldn't place the vague absences he felt when facing his computer, and it took time for us between his effusive soliloquies to realize that Yusuf was profoundly terrified when looking forward. On the couch, Yusuf entertained me with his exuberances, but the nature of these interests slowly shifted to more morbid concerns. He was preoccupied by future terrorist attacks, by the horrors that have erupted so frequently on the global scene. His parents experienced their own early traumas in Jordan, and Yusuf too spent an isolated 2 years in Azraq, where when he was 6 and 7, not speaking the language, with allusions that he made to sexual assault and physical abuse in the household there. His father had been a violent man who yelled with a temper that terrified young Yusuf, and he remembered being frozen in the face of his father's physical attacks on his mother. Our work took a more fragmented turn after a dream with my association. He dreamt that he was at home, but he was upside down, on the ceiling, and then on the wall, only gradually aware that he had turned and would remain upside down. I immediately thought of Kafka's Metamorphosis and said, like Gregor Samsa. Yusuf was stunned by the reference and felt very uncomfortable. In subsequent sessions, he was profoundly sleepy and he retreated. He said, "There's a thin membrane between the inside of a bubble and the outside, and I'm caught there." He said, "I'm orbiting the galaxy around a black hole, and there's the event horizon, and we're going to be pulled in." He said, "I've fallen through the center of the earth. There's a volcano spewing lava, and we're in a life raft without protective gear." In many of these sessions, Yusuf would fall asleep in the middle of such descriptions. I felt at a loss, floating with him, where any attempt to explore the images took him further out to sea. By this time, he had graduated college, was working as an anesthesia tech in a city hospital surgery unit. He came in with story after gruesome story of mutilations, amputations, traumatic rescues, punctuated with sleep. He would just drift off on the couch and be gone. Gradually, Yusuf slept less in sessions and was more aware of his absences. The orbit closed more closely around his family, and rather than the kind of galaxy-wide dread with black holes, things felt more intimate and yet frightening given that intimacy. So although compelled by last sessions as a background for our daily work, I begin each session attending as much as I can to the present moment, the immediacy of a situation that more or less begins as Yusuf enters, but that has started already with my anticipating him in the particular mood that I find myself. In a recent Monday's session, Yusuf is bright with a smile as he walks into my office, and I find myself smiling in turn. He's buoyant in a way that lifts my late afternoon torpor. I was very groggy after having gone out for lunch. And he says, "I was just reading about this chef who cooks with open fires. Quite a life, man. Live in the woods, cook what's around you, really roasting things." Yusuf is on the couch, and I sit with my eyes closed, my smile lingering as I take pleasure in the open fires and really roasting. My particular epoche is in the attitude that privileges the perceptive moment, right? The chef in here, rather than attending to Yusuf's reading out there. Joseph and I are living in these woods right now, where we cook what's around us. And I'm bodily attuned, feeling my way into the moment, watching and listening and tasting for what emerges, careful to notice how I can flatten the moment with my acceptance of the mundane, accepting the talking about without being attuned to experiencing now. The profundity of psychoanalytic play is in the depth of the immediate situation, where words are a perceptual process in breath and timbre and tone that forms in the phenomenal field in here, in the session. The symbolic function of words is undergirded by the sensuousness of expression, where meaning happens in the shifts of bodily perceptual experience. This is part of a seamless totality, a porously rhythmic and undifferentiated movement or flow, where shifts in the form field occur prior to a differentiation of you, of me, where an attunement to words with their meanings and references are given in detail and texture of the bodily moment in motion. But it is in motion toward a future, having a past, every moment being this sort of folding and unfolding back and forth. The intersubjective setting of the session comes to form or falls apart in a temporal flow. So we basically have just a little exchange here so far, right? In the next moment, Joseph sighs, a deep exhale that initially feels content and open, but was also, in my body, vaguely unsettling. I can't define the character in words, the character of this unsettling in words, but my own smile lingers no more. The sigh was an atmospheric event, an immediate mooded co-presence of shared air, space, and sensitivity that did not reach direct reflection. It was comparable to a barometric drop in pressure. The sky is still clear, but something's amiss. Birds stop chirping. There's a preternatural stillness that is a deep tissue phenomenon, registered both in and between in a way that cannot be separated. But this intercorporeal presence with Joseph also provides an immediate ground for the figure of his otherness, all that I can't know in his skin. We share a situation where our senses, moods, attunements are part of a single organism, and yet we find ourselves in profoundly different positions in it, a connected separateness that was yet to be developed or form into something representable. The sigh changes the feel of the roast, shifts the experience of the open fire. Something is awry, and the anticipation of it shifts the feeling of the before. All of a sudden, it feels like a different fire, and it feels like a different roast. I think at the time, one of the main, I like to cook, and in my own analysis, one of the main metaphors in the analysis, especially early on, was the couch as a grill. And me as the meat. So Joseph continues then. Today is my father's birthday. I realize, he says, as a result of what you and I do, I really love him. There's this softening. But that makes having a conversation harder. He and I were talking about understanding children. how hard it is when they don't have language. Just be open to them. But that's the hard thing to do. With my father, it was a one-sided relationship. I didn't know what I felt, how to say it. And it's a very unequal thing. It's a very terrifying thing, and I worry I'll find myself trapped. My cousin, he'd have a tantrum. He was driving my uncle crazy, and I just don't want to fall into that. All right, so the shift is striking. Right? Notice the movement between the different tenses of time in what he's saying and what he's feeling. The happy roasting foreground transposes where Yusuf's softening opens a terrifying feeling of being trapped. The disquieting nature of his sigh in the background, there's a bodily foreboding, right? Softening. But in the face of an unequal and one-sided father, trapped, not knowing what he feels and how to say it, the baby without words. The terror of not having language, soft openness that turns, a tantrum in the offing, dreaded. This is unfolding in the moment. Yusuf isn't describing something in the past. He's expressing the softening of a moment with me where the pleasure and affection opens deep dread, transforming the softness to wordless vulnerability, where a tantrum remembered is not simply memory, but an anticipated explosion transforming now in an entirely different past-future configuration. Although silent in this shift, I feel the unequal in Yusuf's terror, and as such participate in the very setting he expresses. The dreaded tantrum is figural, and I say, a tantrum expresses a lot, I think. I feel the discharge of a tantrum, and I'm seeing in my own experience my son as a little kid out of control, so hard to contain. And I think at that moment, it's without form really, an explosion. And on the couch, Yusuf disappears. He's not simply without words. I lose him. I lose a sense of his presence and awareness in the moment. Is he asleep? No. This is more like entering a fog, and I sit waiting in a homogeneous void, losing the orientation between us. Now, our patients and us, although we're fundamentally connected, we're also so separate. I have no fucking clue what's going on with him in that moment. I unwittingly detonated the moment by connecting terrifying and tantrum, and there's a sudden shift in the depth of the field. Such moments are familiar to us and are hard to describe. My waiting isn't disconnected or alienated, but it is dislocated, groping, feeling about in the spatio-temporal field without edges or borders, a field of weight, W-A-I-T and W-E-I-G-H-T, in the dark. When I associated from Yusuf's dream in the earlier session to Gregor Samsa, we entered a night world. His silences covered us both like a fog, hard to see, feel, to think, to have reverie. Yusuf's black hole and center of the earth descriptions are like lightning flashes in the dark, sudden illuminations that positioned us in harrowing circumstances that just as suddenly disappeared into the mist. In the current moment, I think about groping in the dark, and I say, a Gregor Samsa moment? Calling to that particular past, but now holding on to my son by the explosion of a temper tantrum. And at that point, Yusuf stirs. I just lost myself. I don't feel the feelings. I'm talking and then I'm not there. Blank. A blank out. Uh-oh. A blackout. What am I blocking out? This is scary. It reminds me of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where a secret is at the bottom of one of the leader's two brains, and he erased the process by putting it there. Is it that kind of thing? So what is expressed with, I just lost myself? A self was not feeling, not there, and yet Yusuf is there as dark matter. There's the weight of him, and I feel in the room, a gravitational pull that distorts a spatio-temporal field that would have been so different had he not been bodily there. There is a one-sided and unequal relating where Yusuf didn't know what he felt, but where his absence is a palpable presence, and where I loom in my presence in relation to his absence, full of my own self. As I become more clear that I am groping in the dark, Yusuf finds himself and describes his own scary groping in the midst of a blank black blockout. It's not so much my thoughts about groping, but my actual in-touch felt groping that I believe leads to another shift in process with Yusuf finding himself again. The Bionian concept container contained is relevant here, where the analyst's containing function is grounded in the capacity to think and thus to transform raw sensory experience into the building blocks of a thought narrative. From a phenomenological perspective, the containing function is in the analyst's capacity to inactively receive, to organize, form in relation to field, subject in relation to world, interpersonal and undifferentiated intersubjectivity in relation to other that allows for transformations in the phenomenal field, continued shifts in depth. Yusuf sees further. A secret at the bottom of one of the leader's two brains, and he erased the process of putting it there. We have here two brains in one, a perfect metaphor really for our encounter, a secret, something hidden and forgotten between the mind brains. Rather than elaborating this fertile image, though, I return to what's terrifying and say, a blackout with a secret. I wonder if it's more about how hard it can be when there's no language for things, when things get one-sided in that way. And with this, Yusuf disappears again, silent and inert. I can feel my push back into the father scene with my own one-sided and unequal proclivities. And as I feel this, Yusuf returns. This is really mysterious. I don't know where I just went. Something about my dad. Man, it's like pieces coming together. Something like you can gradually see, and then there's a bomb going off. And with that, I responded, a tantrum bomb? And Yusuf replies with growing animation, yeah, some big explosion. I feel the excitement in this and say, between an explosion and a blank. And with a startled jolt, Yusuf stabs his finger in the air, exclaiming, oh, I had this dream. I'm going to stop there. The clinical process. I just have a very small thing to say about this. So I'm going to stop the process here, a little over 5 minutes into an hour. Can you believe it? We all do this, right? This is what we, as analysts, we live. And phenomenologists. In this small folding and unfolding of lived experience, you can see the repetitions, the shifts back and forth that nonetheless lead to something new. As I feel my way into the one-sided father experience, a past alive in the present, we form the paternal forces that were the background to Yusuf's terrified, trapped child without language. We could transform an explosion into a burst of perception. I had a dream, rather than a formless annihilation. Pieces coming together, then boom. But with my paternal push in the foreground, we can see the dad pieces coming together. Between the explosion and the blank, the tantrum bomb became a transformative push of its own into new dream perception, new lived perceptual meaning. In this process, time transforms through the shifts in experience created in the between, intersubjective, and other. These are temporal transformations of the moment, après-coup transformations of new past significations through engagements in the present, and avant-coup transformations of a new future significations formed in the deepening well of a new past. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack. That was really wonderful. Okay, now, are you okay? Okay, good. Ooh, an explosion. Okay, now I would like to introduce Dr. Peter Shabad. Dr. Shabad is a clinical associate professor of psychology at Northwestern University Medical School. He is also on the supervisory and teaching faculty of the Chicago Center for Psychoanalysis and on the faculty of the Chicago Institute for Psychoanalysis. Dr. Shabad is the co-editor of The Problem of Loss and Mourning, Psychoanalytic Perspectives, and the author of Despair and the Return of Hope, Echoes of Mourning in Psychotherapy. He is writing a new book entitled Seizing the Vital Moment, Passion, Shame, and Mourning, which will be published by Routledge. Dr. Shabad has published numerous book chapters and papers on diverse topics such as giving and receiving, loss and mourning, shame, parental envy, spite, and regret. He has a private practice in psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic therapy in Chicago. Peter.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm going to make a comment halfway through this paper because there are kind of two papers I was ambivalent about writing. And one is the one I wrote. And the other, which has a lot to do with how we can face the future with courage. What allows us to face the future with courage, basically. That's really what the paper's about. A kind of hopeful, positive anticipation of the future. What allows for that? But there's another paper that actually might be even more, a little bit intertwined with what Jack is writing about, and something I'm really interested in. Once we have a hopeful anticipation in a treatment, is that enough? Or is there something else that we need? Or do we just lead people up to the edge of a cliff? And whether they make the leap off the cliff is not up to us. And that's a whole other paper about the difference between anticipation and the leap into actual experience. And I'm working on that in a different form. But I was kind of caught between these two. This comes first in a sense, so that's the one I wrote first. This is called To Renew Each Moment Toward the Welcoming Relationship with the Future Other. Jane is a 43-year-old single woman who came for psychotherapy with presenting problems of depression and suicidal ideation. In the few months leading up to her first appointment, she had also become distressed because she was breaking appointments with different people in her professional life. This unreliability alarmed her especially because she had always taken great pride in fulfilling her responsibilities and obligations. Rather than showing up for these appointments, Jane only wanted to stay in bed and put the covers over her head. From an early age, Jane was groomed for a life of high ambition and success. She began taking piano lessons at the age of 4, which continued throughout her school years. She continued to play in the school band throughout high school and was admitted to one of the top conservatories in the United States. She went on to perform throughout the world as an acclaimed concert pianist. 6 years ago, Jane decided to switch careers and was admitted to a high-level academic humanities program. Both her instructors and peers in the program recognized her as a, quote, star pupil. This is in Jane's words. While still a graduate student, Jane was even asked by the program director to teach a couple of classes, which was unusual in this particular program. Jane's life of performance, achievement, and charmed success was not only relegated to her work, but spilled into her personal relationships as well. As a young child, she had been elevated prematurely into an adult role as partner to her father and caretaker of her mother. Jane's father was a successful lawyer and prominent in local politics. Already early in life, he brought Jane into a sphere of influence, and on a number of occasions, she accompanied him to prestigious public functions instead of his wife. Jane described her mother as anxious, intrusive, and childish, a woman who was both pathetic and quite demanding. Jane felt she often had no choice but to cater to her mother's demands and fill the role of dutiful daughter diligently. I should say that when she was about 7 years old, she asked her mother, almost begged her mother, if she could stop taking piano lessons, which is an important thing, I think, and her mother refused her. Jane became entrapped within her parents' divide. On a daily basis, she felt enormous pressure to fill the void for both parents individually that neither of them could provide for each other. Eventually, the public sphere of social relations, by the way, I wanted to just say one thing also, just add this interesting to both parents would refer to the other parent, to Jane, by their first name. In other words, not by mom or dad, but by their first name. In other words, there is no sense of Jane's perceptions and what she's feeling about these people. Eventually, the public sphere of social relations, emptied of desire, hope, and trust, became a meaningless world of performing mechanically for the designs of others, while her own unmet needs and despair became encapsulated in an ever-shrinking private time and space in which she was left only to lick her own wounds. How can we understand Jane's life situation and current symptoms of depression as manifested in not wanting to get out of bed? If we were to look at a day as a metaphor for the entirety of a life, then how might Jane's difficulty in getting out of bed, how might we understand Jane's difficulty in getting out of bed and beginning each day anew, the rest of her life in a sense? This section is called Leaping Toward the Other, the Passion of Self-Renewal. Life is always in a dynamic process of becoming. The birth of incoming moments from the future to present give way to the receding death of those moments, and a new influx of moments from the future again. Like each one of these moments, our individual lives also have a finite, never-to-be-duplicated quality. As unique persons, we have never lived before and will never live again. It is immensely challenging for human beings to remain open to the onrush of incoming moments without defenses fueled by their shames and anxieties. In fact, it may be worth asking whether our constant craving for more time, our need for an unbounded deathlessness, derives from our inability to fulfill our lives and relationships while we are experiencing them. When we do not open up to the incoming gift of life's fleeting instants and allow them to pass without actualizing our contributions to the human endeavor, the unrealized moments that were not seized while the iron was hot may become sentimentalized after their passing. For example, we may observe that whenever we do not pass through a stage of life as successfully as we would have liked, we get stuck. We delay our leave taking indefinitely and attempt to relive and redress what went wrong, as if begging the powers that be for one more chance to get it right. In begging the fates for another chance to live out missed opportunities, we shift our open-hearted focus from living for and toward the realization of future possibilities to an enclosed preoccupation with an idealized, reified past as a sanctuary against the steady march of time. This vicious cycle of denying death may be perpetuated indefinitely. We procrastinate various encounters with love and loss, which are then followed by subsequent regrets for missed opportunities. And then in our desperate pleas to the fates for more time, we deny our finite limits once again. How then can individuals best seize the opportunities of each passing moment and realize the unique significance of their lives while they're living it? Elsewhere, I've described how human beings have a passionate life force that pushes them forward toward the future, a life force that Bergson referred to as élan vital, or vital impetus. Our access to the vital impetus of our passion is indispensable to our capacity for self-renewal and the ability to meet the constant flow of time on its own ever-evolving terms. This passionate life force is rooted in a drive for self-realization in which we creatively devote our lives to an other beyond ourselves. When I say beyond ourselves, I mean specifically, I'm very Winnicottian in this sense, beyond what Winnicott calls the sphere of omnipotence, the omnipotent reach, our creative reach. It has to be, the other has to be beyond our creative reach. A receptive response from an other mirrors back the special contribution that we are making, providing us at once with both a sense of belonging and significance as individuals who have something of value to offer, thus infusing our labors of passion with meaning. Kierkegaard uses the term repetition, perhaps confusingly to our ears, to describe a passionate movement of freedom to renew and actualize oneself in each incoming moment received from the future. Claire Carlyle beautifully summarizes Kierkegaard's thinking on the subject, and I want to quote her. Concrete existence, unlike the necessary being with which logic deals, has reality only insofar as it continues to be actualized at every moment. Existence is always coming into existence, arising and passing away and arising again at unfathomable speed. So for an existing thing to endure, to be itself, it must be repeatedly renewed, for without the actualizing movement, it falls into non-being, unquote. As Kierkegaard famously says, it is quite true what philosophy says, that life must be understood backwards. But then one forgets the other principle, that it must be lived forwards. For Kierkegaard, this process of renewal entails leaving behind the home comforts of our mind through a passionately inspired leap of faith in which one's potentiality is repeatedly actualized in each moment. He uses the metaphor of leap precisely to highlight the radical continuity of action, as opposed to mere shifts in thought, and the necessity of putting ourselves at exposed risk and opportunity for inspired redemption in order to move through genuine change. This whole notion of leap is probably where I get the whole metaphor, by the way, of the cliff, leaping off the cliff. And here's the leap into the next paper, probably, of leaping from anticipation into experience. To the extent that the temporal changes required for the unfolding unpredictability of our own growth into the future parallels the movement needed to approach the stranger who is different from us. The affirmation of our passion is centrally implicated in our evolution as ethical individuals. Letting go of oneself in the current moment to engage the different other of who one will become implies also a constant emergence from the loyalties to oneself and to one's own kind, whether that be one's own family, nation, religion, species, tribe, race, or gender. This section is called The Inspiration to Renew, the welcoming receptivity of the future. The daunting journey across this threshold between self and other is traversed through the interchange of giving and receiving. The capacity to tolerate the exposed vulnerability of that journey is greatly influenced by whether our contributions, beginning with the gift of our births, have been accepted by a significant other. More specifically, when we place ourselves at the mercy of a world of otherness, the way in which we are received, whether we are welcomed or rebuffed, rejected, has a major effect on the projective lenses through which we then view the unpredictability of our future as an open horizon of renewable possibilities, hoping for the best, or fated recurrence of our unmourned traumas, fearing the worst. A mother's welcoming receptivity to her child, it could be a father obviously, to her child's spontaneous offerings becomes an implicit gift of recognition back to the child. In accepting his offerings into her good graces, she enables her child to feel that his love is fruitful, thereby providing him with the initial sense of having something good inside that is worthwhile to someone else. That sense of goodness and usefulness, in turn, enables her child to feel worthy enough to affirm his passion and further his development. Here's a brief illustration of this sort of interchange. A 3-year-old child draws a stick figure and says to the mother, "Mommy, look what I did." And the mother responds by saying, "That's great. What is that? Who is that?" The child says, "It's a man." And the mother responds by saying, "That's the greatest man I ever saw." The child, feeling like no one else has ever done a picture quite like that before, smiles with great pleasure and then offers the picture to her and says, "This is for you, Mommy." When she concludes this interchange by saying, "Thank you so much," the child's passion, inspired by her gracious reception, moves him to creatively generate another stick figure and present it to her again. Ricoeur has noted how the triad of give, receive, and give and return is central to the development of mutual recognition. Specifically, he emphasizes how, quote, "gratitude lightens the weight of obligation to give and return and reorients this toward a generosity equal to the one that led to the first gift," unquote. As the child repeatedly makes an offering to the mother and receives back the gift of her receptive recognition, his gratitude in turn fuels a passion of generosity to further transform the times and spaces separating them into creatively fashioned offerings. It is interesting to note here that create and generous have the same Latin root, genera, meaning to beget, produce. Perhaps we can understand this inspired movement of gratitude more clearly with a small illustration of a young toddler just learning how to walk. As the mother calls out to him from the other side of the room and awaits him with open arms, he struggles through a few tentative steps before collapsing into her arms in a warm embrace. The toddler beams with pleasure at his newly discovered competence and his mother's appreciation of his creative feat. Now this mother walks out of the room into the hallway and calls out her son's name while out of clear sight. His memory of her pride in him inspires a passion to search for her over the uncertain spaces separating them and to present her with the gift of his renewed accomplishment. Further, we might imagine that this mother, who is out of clear sight, is not only calling from the hallway, but also from the future, encouraging him to come toward her. Her familiar voice, emanating as if from the wilderness, now becomes internalized as his calling and becomes the embodiment of developmental hope and movement. The impassioned movement to respond to this calling drives development forward, making it possible to bear the inevitable transitions and losses of psychic growth. In this sense, when a child appears to relinquish relationship for separateness, it is a separateness that paradoxically is contained by a transformed version of that relationship awaiting the child in the future. This section is called Trauma and Shame, Backing into the Self-Enclosed Future. This open-ended receptivity to incoming moments from the future, informed by a welcoming relationship with an awaiting other, is sensitive to the touch of rejection and can quickly close down in the aftermath of significant psychic injury. In the immediate aftermath of traumatic experiences, children dissociate from their vulnerabilities by reflexively shifting their center of gravity from an embodied self to a disembodied mind in order to cover up and preempt further injury by forming an enclosed relationship with themselves. Whereas we human beings are born as semicircles who seek to be completed by another, we enclose that circle of relationship upon ourselves narcissistically when our expectant hopes for relationship are ruptured. From this viewpoint, the self-enclosed conservative aspect of narcissism may reflect an attempt to take up the slack for the absence of a relationship with another by forming a homegrown relationship with oneself. Children often do not perceive that their traumatic experiences happened by accident, but attribute their occurrence to the intentionality of a punitive authority. Moreover, since as Winnicott says, there is no trauma outside of omnipotence, and by the way, I should say that I consider that pronouncement of Winnicott for me, a core pronouncement that accounts very much for the origins of shame, which I'm going to write about. Moreover, since as Winnicott says, there's no trauma outside of omnipotence, the enclosed disembodied mind of such children is informed by shame for deserving and incurring that punishment. Instead of shame spurring an acknowledgement of our humility as fundamentally limited creatures and ethical responsibility toward the other, as Levinas has suggested in Totality and Infinity, many persons interpret shame experiences as retributive, comeuppance for the hubris of overstepping their limits. Rather than acknowledge those limits, such individuals adhere to a self-destructive omnipotence in which they feel they have created their own victimizations. In the wake of sufferings recast as punishments, the consciousness of one's fall from creator to creature then is reinforced too much by one's own self-degradation. Further, the fact that shame emerges only after traumatic experience reflects also a dissociative shift from a lived-in psyche soma of the present to a disembodied mental future in which the individual turns time on its head. From this all-knowing vantage point of omniscient hindsight, this person casts judgments on sufferings that had been experienced with an unknowing prospective time orientation, and berates himself mercilessly that he should have known better than to let himself succumb to the weakness of his victimization. This reversal in perspective from an embodied perspective, a view of time, to the retrospective lens of disembodied mind is not unlike leaping out of a bus going in one direction and hopping on another bus moving in the opposite direction. Instead of facing the future with a progressive time orientation, the disembodied mind faces backward toward the past with a regressive time orientation. Yet since organismic movement moves inexorably toward the future, such individuals may feel like they are reluctantly backing into the future, to quote one of my patients. As the wide-eyed gaze of curiosity closes in on itself, the individual no longer welcomes the infinite times of the future or the infinite spaces of the other person with open arms. The retroactive shadow of self-consciousness, informed by the aim of annulling the flow of lived time and perfecting one's inherent limitations, threatens to undermine all self-expressiveness and activity with its tormenting echoes of second-guessing. It is not coincidental, then, that this self-enclosed shame consciousness, like the petrifying spell cast by Medusa's evil eye, freezes the life force of human passion. Rather than growth being experienced like a passionately willed process, the passive self-doubting child comes to anticipate the uncertainties of separation, transition, and novelty with crippling anxiety as something that is always happening too quickly before she is ready. In shifting his center of gravity from body to disembodied mind, an individual gains a sense of distance from himself and fosters the illusion that he has annulled the flow of time at the site of the disruption so that he can recapture the actuality of the victimization from which he dissociated. From within a defensive posture of self-enclosure, we thus not only are using our disembodied minds to preempt further injury, but we are also attempting to reverse the flow of time and heal the rupture between mind and body prior to becoming alienated from ourselves. This search to recapture the actuality of traumatic experience from within the perspective of one's disembodied mind, however, is doomed to failure, inasmuch as we take dissociative flight from our embodied experience of helpless vulnerability and shame that was endured passively from within our bodies. Our lives are not being inhabited from within. Without a corpus of lived experience to fall back on for a sense of certainty, our minds work feverishly to affirm that our suffering was not just a figment of our imagination, but a real event. Since we are dissociating from the very same tale of the real that we are chasing, we can never catch up to the actuality of our victimization. Bergson thus has pointed out that the emotional quality of intensity cannot be translated into a measurable quantity of what he called extensity. Measurability or quantification may often refer to visible physical phenomena that cannot readily be applied to the difficult to grasp quality of emotional life. Kierkegaard, by the way, Winnicott also has talked about this in his birth trauma paper, where he talks about after the fact that we are given, the mind is given to quantification through counting and categorizing. After, and he specifically refers to what babies do after birth and birth trauma. I think it was called birth trauma, birth memories, and Kierkegaard has referred to this preoccupation with a past that has now been abstracted from the concrete flow of time as recollection. Through the lens of one's self-enclosure, this person does not understand backwards and live forwards as Kierkegaard recommends, but attempts to live backward into a future that seems to be nothing but a faded recurrence of the past. Since the self-enclosed individual cannot get beyond the circularities of his own mind, he becomes a prisoner of his own transference perceptions. He projects his shame and mistrust onto the blank canvas of an unknowable future, and then retreats in trepidation and dread from encounters with another who has been inscribed with the monstrosity of his own phantoms. In fear, as he continues to sidestep, retreat, or wage war against this enemy other, life continues to go unlived. In returning to Jane, then, she despairs that her past life of robotic performance will overtake and foreclose all future possibilities with a fatefulness that she cannot escape. Now, in the state of full-born retreat, she no longer recognizes herself. On a number of occasions, she has either called herself a failure or fucked up or sick for not being able to keep up with the responsibilities of her life. If we view Jane's resistant inertia as an active protest against the counterfeit life she has led, then her suicidal ideation does not reflect so much a wishful fantasy to end her life permanently, or just plain a diagnosis of categorizing her as just pure depressed. I think it misses the point. But it's a way to bring her life that was not entirely of her choosing to a halt and embark on a new beginning. There's a resistance here, a rebellion that has to be paid attention to in that resistant inertia. When Jane declared that there is something sick about her because she cannot keep up the challenging pace of her life, I responded, "It is not you who've been sick, but the coercive pressures that have sickened you. You had to take the radical step of staying in bed and boycott a life that was not yours. So if and when you decide to get out of bed, you will be sure that future day in life will belong to you and you alone." By siding with the nonverbal resistance in Jane's symptomatology against the outside world, I've earned credibility in her eyes for aligning myself with the orphan voice of her suffering and keeping her hopes alive for a renewable future. She has taken small steps toward trusting that I will be waiting for her as an accepting other if and when she ventures out into her day. Instead of adhering to her habitual stoicism and self-enclosed encapsulation, she's called frequently between sessions, and I've made special efforts to respond to her. In recent months, she has become seriously involved in a romantic relationship. She has begun to open to a future that will bring whatever possibilities it will bring. A postscript to this is that very recently, actually last week, she quit her, she went further and she's gotten out of bed, but she also quit that humanities high-level academic program. She doesn't know where her future will lead, but she knows what she doesn't want. And actually, I didn't flinch very much, and she was very surprised that I didn't stop her. And so, anyway, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. We're going to have a discussion by Elizabeth Corpt. Is past president, supervising analyst, faculty board member of the Massachusetts Institute for Psychoanalysis, teaching associate at Harvard Medical School, Department of Psychiatry at the Cambridge Health Alliance Program for Psychotherapy. She's published and presented nationally and internationally on clinical generosity, the impact of social class on the forming of an analytic identity, and on relational ethics. Her most recent article, The Compilations of Caring and the Ethical Turn in Psychoanalysis, is published in the relational book series, The Ethical Turn, Otherness and Subjectivity in Contemporary Psychoanalysis. Elizabeth?
Thank you, Jack. I've been thinking as I've been sitting here, we are all so patient with sitting and listening to someone read to us. That's amazing. I've entitled my discussion, Time and Sanctuary. Two patients, each in an idiosyncratic way, seek the sanctuary of the analytic space as a time out of sorts, a time out from the pains and psychic vacancies of their lives. What are their intentions and hopes in doing so? On the surface, one is desperately wanting respite from the pain of her perceived failures and the intense shame of her retreat, of her recent reliability, while the other, compliant enough about coming into treatment, appears somewhat nonchalant and even puzzled by what all the fuss is about his lack of initiative and future orientation. Each one enters treatment to halt the ceaseless flow of time that no longer seems to provide either of them with a meaningful existence. They are out of sync with themselves. As therapists, we hardly have dominion over time. After all, we ourselves live by the clock. We don't have the power to stop time, but we do have ways of seducing it, prolonging it, conflating it, playing with it, and even suspending it. We're practiced wizards of time, protecting a territory within which time itself becomes suspended. A lifetime can be distilled within a 45-minute window or a 5-minute window, and a future that has seemed blank and empty can suddenly open up to become alive, vivid, and beckoning. Stallworth, borrowing from Harry Potter, talks about port keys, the kind of wormholes that can transport patients back in time. Backwards, forwards, après coup, avant coup. With the analytic sanctuary, we bracket time and slow it down enough so that people in our care are able to make sense of something on a human scale, at a human pace, something connected to their uniqueness as individuals. We court unconscious processes and dreams. We love to turn time on its head. We might venture to say we are fearless in the face of time. Those who misread us think we simply luxuriate in it. But listening to these finely wrought clinical examples, we know that taking time on for the benefit of our patients in all its forms, past, present, and future, is a very serious business. Espen Hammer, the philosopher, in his essay on modern time, says the following: in the village, the day started not with the beep of an alarm clock, but with the birds gradually beginning to twitter, the light slowly starting to shine through the windows. The change was softer, less precisely calculable, and intimately tied to a more fluid and large-scale sense of rhythm. In all likelihood, the inhabitants of a medieval village could also contrast subliminal time. Oops. Oh, darn. Hold on a second. Sublunar time, and were allowed to participate in a higher order of being. So perhaps Jane and Yusuf are each on a quest to make contact with their own personal medieval time clocks, their own higher order of being, as their souls appear to have gotten lost along the way. It is fascinating that we find both Jane and Yusuf at some point turning to sleep as a method for locating themselves. Jane, with her resistance to get out of bed, turning to the sleep space as the place where she draws the line that both shames her yet empowers her to finally come into treatment. Yusuf's sleepiness overtakes him on the couch once he begins to shift from holding court as his mother's entrancing son to his more morbid and serious concerns. Jane and Yusuf are reaching toward another dimension of time, a time without numbers, primitive time, medieval time, time prior to the chronometer or the school calendar or the appointment book, what the Greeks called kairos, or the indeterminate moment that is right for something to occur. So our consulting rooms, among other things, are respites for the time-weary and the temporally challenged or traumatized, for those who feel tormented by time, passed over by time, unfairly judged by time, crushed by the onrush of time. Lombardi focuses on a psychotic patient's profound confusion regarding temporality and attends minutely to the patient's budding capacity for entertaining a futurity as a sign of growth in psychic capacity. Margulies writes about the trauma of trauma as falling out of the world and therefore out of a sense of time. Patients often appear on our doorsteps bewildered by their own temporal confusions and seeking a way to catch up with themselves or slow down enough to retrieve previously abandoned parts of themselves, to find within themselves their personal sense of timing, rhythm, pace, and tempo, and then reconciling it with their narrative histories and tattered hopes. Peter and Jack each bring their own unique sensibilities to the temporal concerns of their patients. Peter asks us to consider the snapshot of Jane's taking refuge in her bed and making use of it as a metaphor that speaks for the entirety of her life. As has been his project, Peter works and thinks from a perspective that takes in the developmental sweep of time. He is exquisitely tuned to existential time as he considers both Jane's mundane life concerns along with the fate of her life force and trajectory, moments in the early parts of one's life can mark and influence each subsequent moment for better or worse by either opening or foreclosing the passionate movement into a welcoming future. Jane is one of those gifted individuals whose outward precocious capacities outrun her ability to keep up with her inner capacities, leaving her with star status that becomes intensely painful, not enjoyable and enriching. Even though Peter tells us that Jane returned to her mind as her primary compensatory object, thereby becoming disembodied and mechanical in the various ways she performed her life, it's of note that it is her body that refuses to get out of bed to meet time's next demand. Somehow her psyche soma, her mind-body, managed a rebellion in unison on her behalf. I share Peter's belief in Winnicott's notion that the mind becomes the mind object when the primary caretaking surround traumatically fails, but I also believe that the body silently registers the accumulating detritus of shame and trauma over time. The mind is left coaxing and lugging the burdened body around until it can no longer do so. What a relief it must have been for Jane when she finally made her way to Peter's office to hear him say, "It is not you that are sick, but the coercive pressures that have sickened you." In saying this, Peter opens the slightest sliver of a possibility that there could be a future time around the corner or down the hall beyond Jane's present sickness. And I have to think that Peter can't help but inject a dose of his own passionate conviction in elan vital. But beyond that, I think Peter's response stirred something already deep within Jane, something long sequestered away. I found myself wondering, was there a time when Jane felt sheer joy at playing the piano, with her mind and body acting as one, feeling exhilaration in the fact that she could master the instrument with such ease and pleasure? Could the tick of the metronome at one time have been felt as a comfort to her, even serving as a replacement heartbeat to fill in for her distracted, narcissistic, and rancorous parents? Did Jane's early joy in her gift of musicality only eventually become empty and meaningless as she was trotted around as a trophy replacement wife for her father, an emotional caretaker for her mother? Did the pressures of being in this family life devoted more to prominence and influence than in authentically lived pleasure and pride in one's gifts and developmental gains kill her spirit? Were her many achievements and successes all pathological accommodations? Or did some nascent joy lie in wait for the right time or the right person to help her reclaim it? Or did the dominant precocity of her talents make it difficult for her to learn the baby steps and incremental satisfaction of developmental skill building, especially if there was no one there to help her attend to and cross developmental thresholds at the appropriate time? Peter quotes Claire Carlyle on Kierkegaard, and she says, "Concrete existence, unlike the necessary being with which logic deals, has reality only insofar as it continues to be actualized at every moment. Existence is always coming into existence, arising and passing away, and arising again at unfathomable speeds. So for an existing thing to endure, to be itself, it must be repeatedly renewed, for without the actualizing moment, it falls into non-being," unquote. Philosophically, I understand Kierkegaard's intent at getting us to consider the importance of renewal. But as a psychoanalyst, I wonder if Jane's attempt to actualize at every moment and function at unfathomable speed actually began to turn in on itself in a perverse way, resulting in a fear of falling into non-being by thinking somehow that it was all or nothing. Here's where our work begins, creating a space for a reflective middle ground that is developmentally tempered and titrated, a safe sanctuary where gathering up the past, reflecting on it, considering the present moment, and contemplating the possibility of a future become linked together. A pause, a breath, a warm, encouraging presence waiting to receive you, a place for simply being Jane, one step at a time. In Peter's approach, approach, which feels actually quite maternal to me, even though in a discussion last night, Peter told me that he feels himself as much more paternal than maternal, Jane begins to find her own sense of timing. Jack, on the other hand, takes us into intimate micro-moments spent with Yusuf and builds them out, phenomenologically extending them into sensual realms, into Jack's reveries about Yusuf and his past, as well as Jack's private reveries about his own sense memories, as a way to begin to understand the density of their being together. They are together, as Jack says, a seamless totality, a porous and undifferentiated movement or flow. Jack holds he and Yusuf in mind as one organism. I hear in his description the phenomenologist Merleau-Ponty, who says in The Visible and the Invisible, quote, "If I am close enough to the other who speaks to hear his breath and feel his effervescence and his fatigue, I almost witness in him, as in myself, the awesome birth of vociferation. This new reversibility and the emergence of the flesh as expression are the point of insertion of speaking and thinking in a world of silence," unquote. Out of the shared psychic flesh emerges a shared language between them. So it is not Yusuf's developmental trajectory per se that concerns Jack, but rather the intricate meaning traces of Yusuf's lived life and how they make themselves known, come alive in the moments of their being together. Casual banter and charm slowly gives way to undigested memory made up of fragments of unsettling, even terrifying sights, sounds, sensations, and undigested feelings. Trauma has a way of playing tricks with memories and timelines, obscuring Yusuf's developmental capacity for understanding and for wording his experience. As Jack intuitively knows to do, we have to slow down time to be with Jack and Yusuf. They enter into a temporal flow as Jack listens, but Jack listens as anything but a passive listener. Using all his senses, he takes in every bit of Yusuf. Jack seems acutely aware of the power and impact on Yusuf of his own agility in accessing his subjectivity. He ventures a paternal push, perhaps so as to rouse Yusuf from his maternal too entrancing cocoon of dissociations. As Sartre says, to know is to burst toward, and burst toward Jack does. We see this when Jack meets Yusuf's first dream, in which he awakens to find himself upside down. Jack asks, like Gregor Samsa, the protagonist in Kafka's Metamorphosis, Yusuf is stunned and uncomfortable. What do we make of this? Sleepiness overtakes him in session after session. Did Jack locate Yusuf too quickly? Or was there too much of Jack's subjectivity in the room? Did Yusuf experience this as an overwhelming competitive move? Or was this a kind of loving and well-titrated paternal rough and tumble play, the kind I imagine Jack engaged in with his own son, a new, unsettling, jarring experience for Yusuf, but one that opens up a new kind of longing, perhaps a new kind of longing Yusuf could not ever safely allow himself to experience with his own father. Yusuf's father played rough, far too rough, not in a titrated way that invited Yusuf to come closer and to safely risk more. Yusuf begins to describe his lonely orbits around black holes, spewing volcanoes, feeling stuck inside the membrane between the inside and the outside of a bubble. Jack is right with him, floating together through space, the lava fields just below them. Is it safe to come closer, to make contact? As a seasoned phenomenologist, Jack knows that the outside is inside and the inside is outside. So when Yusuf begins a session with comments about a chef roasting meat outside, Jack knows the real fire is about to take place between them. Jack is right there, ready with kindling, but waits, knowing in the mundane lies the profundity of psychoanalytic play. He notes the barometric shift in Yusuf's narrative when the buoyant story suddenly takes a sudden turn, a realization that it's being his father's birthday, that begins first with a softness and even with a feeling of love, inspired, Yusuf tells us, by their work together. And I think in some way Yusuf began to feel that love from Jack. That suddenly turns to feelings of being trapped, terrified, without words to describe feelings. Dread shows up, fear of a tantrum delivered in displacement via a cousin's. But what if here and now, what is here and now between us? And on it goes with Jack and Yusuf weaving together past, present, future, together facing bombs, then the tantrum bombs, blackouts, blankouts within the membrane they've become. One leader with two brains working toward becoming two minds in search of secrets. Yusuf, being carefully met, feels free at the end to explode into the exuberance of a dream memory. I'd like to thank both our presenters for sharing with us their exquisite sense of clinical timing and their thoughtful and deep understanding of phenomenological and existential time. Thank you. So, yes, so we have 5 minutes. So in rapid fire, yes.
First off, I'm stunned by how gorgeous your presentation is. Thank each of you. Thanks. I'm so appreciative of your thoughtful ability to account for the phenomenology of your experience with each of your clients. I think the thing that struck me most, and I guess particularly because I'm someone who trains graduate students in counseling, you talked a lot about the experience that each of your clients had in terms of their past and how it impacts on their present. What was most striking to me was your ability to be in their present, in the face of what seemed to be their absence from their presence. And it did seem to me that so much of what was profound in what happened for them has a lot to do with your being present to them. And that was not so much the lyrics of what occurred between each of you with your client, but a quality of the music that they were able to hear in their engagements with each of you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think that one of the things that's very present in a lot of contemporary psychoanalytic thought is recognizing the capacity and the necessity to stay alive in the hour. And through staying alive and being present in the hour, inviting and offering the possibility of aliveness to our patients. It's a very difficult thing to do. We can never do it all the time. We always go in and out, but it's something that's central, and I think that you're picking that up. Appreciate that.
Just very quickly, I think for me, part of what I think was really, what I consider really important, I think a lot of practitioners would have diagnosed Jane as just, they would have been very distracted by the depressive symptomatology and the suicidal ideation especially, and wanted to tuck her back very quickly because of their anxiety into her life, which I think would have perpetuated the problem. I think there has to be a kind of unconventionality in the morality of the practitioner in order to get to the rebelliousness of symptomatology sometimes. I partly also believe that when people do things, the actions reflect something self-healing that we're not always privy to. And we have to not only see, I think a lot of what Jane did was what Marion Tolman called the forward edge of phenomena, where there's something there as well that I wanted to attend to. And I think it's very important to attend to that.
Yes?
I just want to pass along a strange reverie I had after Peter's and Jack's presentation, which was, I had this strange curiosity of the two of them meeting, Jane and Yusuf. And I think part of what drove me to that was the Jane being under the covers and Yusuf falling asleep. And I had this fantasy of the two of them under the covers together.
Well, Jack and I have already done that.
I also wanted
We've been there, done that already.
I also am very aware of, know about après-coup and Neutralkeit, but I hadn't thought about avant-coup and the whole idea of hope and where that leads us.
That's a very, very useful thought, that there is, and I think in both Peter's and my piece, there is this sense that Elizabeth pointed out, that there's a push toward or a call for a movement towards the future, and hope captures that pretty well, as does dreaming. I mean, that's so.
One more, or are we out of time?
Wonderful, really stimulating papers, and I think the hope that was there and present in your papers, I think it was articulated by Elizabeth. I hope that both of you can talk more about your bodily selves in the room, and I think it would really richen the papers, which were already great.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's really true. There's so much more that could be said, and I'm sorry that we don't have more time to discuss, because there's a lot that specifically could be unfolded about how we are embodied together in our clinical work.
Thank you very much. Yeah.